Think about what Clyde's life really was. From the age of 22, when he made his Test debut, until the day he died at 80, he was fighting the same battle. A battle for respect, a battle for equality, a battle for the right to be judged by his abilities rather than his skin color. For 58 years, he fought that battle. He became cricket's first black chairman. But racism broke his spirit, and he died heartbroken at 80. Picture this. You're one of the greatest cricket players who ever lived. You've broken barriers your whole life. You've fought racism at every step. You've made it to the very top of world cricket. You're the first black man to chair the International Cricket Council. But deep inside, you know the fight has cost you everything. The racism never really went away. It just got more sophisticated. This is the story of Sir Clyde Walcott, a man who should have been celebrated as a hero. Instead, he died heartbroken, knowing that despite all his achievements, cricket was still not the equal game he had dreamed of. Stay with me, because this story will show you the real cost of fighting racism in professional sports. Let's start with who Clyde Walcott really was. Born on January 17, 1926 in Barbados, Clyde was part of the legendary 3 Ws. That's Walcott, along with Everton Weekes and Frank Worrell, 3 boys from the same small Caribbean island who would go on to dominate world cricket in the 1950s. But among the 3, Clyde was different. He wasn't just a great batsman, he was also a wicket-keeper. Think about how hard that is. Keeping. Wicket means you're crouching behind the stumps for hours, catching balls, making split-second decisions. Then when it's your turn to bat, you have to switch completely and score runs. Clyde did both at the highest level. But what made Clyde truly special wasn't just his cricket skills. It was his intelligence and his determination to fight the system. Even as a young man, Clyde understood that cricket in the 1940s and 1950s was dominated by white administrators. The captains were usually white, the selectors were white, the officials were white. Black players, no matter how talented, were expected to just play and keep quiet. Clyde refused to accept that, and that refusal would define his entire life. Clyde made his Test debut for the West Indies in 1948. Right from the start, he was brilliant. In just his second Test match, he scored 152. That's more than 150 runs in 1 innings. For a wicket-keeper, that was almost unheard of. Most wicket-keepers were picked for their glove work, not their batting. But Clyde was proving that a black Caribbean player could do everything better than anyone expected. Over his Test career, Clyde played 44 matches and scored 98 runs. His batting average was 56.68. To put that in perspective, that's one of the highest averages in Test cricket history. Behind the wicket, he took 53 catches and made 11 stumpings. These aren't just good numbers. These are legendary numbers. Clyde wasn't just playing cricket. He was rewriting what people thought was possible. But here's where the story gets complicated. Even as Clyde was achieving greatness on the field, he was facing constant racism off it. In the 1950s, when the West Indies toured England or Australia, the treatment was often humiliating. Hotels would refuse to serve black players. Restaurants would turn them away. Crowd members would make racist comments. And the cricket authorities, they did nothing to protect their own players. Clyde saw all of this. He experienced it personally. But unlike many players who just tried to ignore the racism, Clyde spoke out about it. He demanded better treatment for his teammates. He challenged the authorities. He refused to just smile and accept discrimination, and that made him enemies. Powerful enemies who would remember his defiance for years to come. The breaking point came in the late 1950s. His early retirement from international cricket was attributed by many to his dissatisfaction with West Indian cricket politics relating to the captaincy. But he himself attributed it to disputes over pay. But people close to Clyde knew the real story. It wasn't just about money, it was about respect. It was about being treated as an equal. It was about seeing young black players coming up through the system and knowing they would face the same discrimination he had faced. Think about the timing of Clyde's retirement. He was only 32 years old. For a batsman of his quality, that's young. Players today regularly play into their late 30s. But Clyde had had enough. He was tired of fighting battles that should never have needed to be fought. He was exhausted by the constant struggle for basic respect. So in 1960, he retired from international cricket. Not because he couldn't play anymore, but because the system had broken his spirit. But retirement from playing didn't mean retirement from cricket. Clyde was too smart, too passionate about the game to just walk away completely. Instead, he decided to fight the system from the inside. If he couldn't change cricket as a player, maybe he could change it as an administrator. It was a brave decision, and it would define the rest of his life. Starting in the 1970s, Clyde began working his way up through cricket administration, first at the local level in Barbados, then regionally with the West Indies Cricket Board. Every step of the way, he faced resistance. There were people who didn't want to see a black man in positions of power. There were others who remembered his outspokenness as a player and held it against him. But Clyde persisted. He was chairman of selectors for many years during the pomp of the teams led by Clive Lloyd and Richards, and he managed a number of sides, including the two that lifted the first two World Cups in 1975 and 1979. Think about what this means. Clyde was directly responsible for selecting and managing some of the greatest cricket teams in history. The West Indies teams of the 1970s and early 1980s were dominant. They were feared around the world, and Clyde was one of the masterminds behind their success. But even as he was achieving success as an administrator, Clyde was still fighting racism. The cricket world in the 1970s and 1980s was still largely controlled by white administrators from England and Australia. Board meetings were often held in exclusive clubs that had never had black members. Decisions were made in private conversations that Clyde was excluded from. The racism had become more subtle, more sophisticated, but it was still there. Moving onwards and upwards, he was president of the West Indies Board for years up to 1993, before he ended his active involvement in the game with the ICC. He was briefly a match referee, but after leaving the presidency of the WICB, he took up the chairmanship of the ICC, the first black person to hold that office, and indeed the first who was not English. This was it, the ultimate breakthrough. Clyde Walcott had become the chairman of the International Cricket Council, the first black man ever to hold the position, the first person who wasn't English to run world cricket. He became the ICC cricket chairman in 1997, in charge of the ICC Code of Conduct, and oversaw investigations into allegations of match fixing. He retired in 2000. For 3 years, from 1997 to 2000, Clyde Walcott was effectively the most powerful man in world cricket. He was responsible for maintaining the integrity of the game. He investigated corruption. He made decisions that affected cricket in every country in the world. You might think that reaching the top of world cricket would have been a moment of pure triumph for Clyde. And in many ways, it was. He had broken the ultimate barrier. He had proved that a black man from a small Caribbean island could rise to run a sport that had been dominated by white elites for more than a century. But the victory was bittersweet. Because even as chairman of the ICC, Clyde could see that the fundamental problems hadn't been solved. The racism was still there. It was just more hidden now. Young black players were still facing discrimination. Cricket was still controlled by old boys networks that excluded people who looked like Clyde. The structures of power hadn't really changed. They had just become more politically correct on the surface while remaining exclusionary underneath. In 1994, Walcott was knighted for his services to cricket, Sir Clyde Walcott. It was recognition of his incredible achievements both as a player and as an administrator. But even the knighthood came with mixed feelings. Here he was, being honored by the same British establishment that had discriminated against him for decades. The irony wasn't lost on him. When Clyde retired from the ICC chairmanship in 2000, he was 74 years old. He had spent more than 50 years in cricket. As a player, he had been one of the greatest of all time. As an administrator, he had risen to the very top of the game. He had broken barriers that seemed impossible to break. But he was tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. The problem was that for all his achievements, for all the barriers he had broken, Clyde could see that cricket was still not the equal, fair game he had dreamed of. Young black players were still facing subtle discrimination. Administrative positions were still largely filled by white men from traditional cricket countries. The old boys' network was still intact, just better at hiding its exclusionary practices. Walcott, Sir Clyde Leopold, OBE, died on August 26, 2006, aged 80. He died at his home in Barbados, surrounded by family. The official cause of death was natural causes, but people close to him knew the truth. Clyde died heartbroken. Not because his own life had been unsuccessful, but because he knew the battle he had fought his entire life was far from over. Sir Clyde's achievements in the world of cricket as player, coach, and administrator is unmatched in the West Indies. History will record Sir Clyde Walcott's pioneering ascendancy to the presidency of the West Indies Cricket Board, as well as to the chairmanship of the International Cricket Council, ICC, the game's governing body. The tributes poured in from around the world. Everyone acknowledged his incredible achievements. But few people talked about the personal cost of those achievements. And while he won many individual victories, he never got to see the war truly won. The tragedy of Clyde Walcott's story is that he achieved everything a person could possibly achieve in cricket. But it wasn't enough to fix the fundamental problems he had identified as a young man. He became the first black chairman of the ICC, but cricket was still run by the same type of people who had discriminated against him decades earlier. He was knighted by the British establishment, but young black cricketers were still facing the same barriers he had faced. After Walcott's death, Michael Holding, the former West Indian fast bowler who made his debut when Clyde was still deeply involved in West Indies cricket, spoke about the profound impact Clyde had on his generation of players. But even Holding acknowledged that Clyde died knowing that much of his work was still unfinished. The cruel irony is that Clyde's greatest professional achievement, becoming ICC chairman, was also the source of his deepest personal disappointment. As chairman, he could see better than anyone how the cricket world really worked. He could see the informal networks of power. He could see how decisions were really made. He could see that despite all the progress, despite all the politically correct language, the fundamental structures of exclusion were still in place. In his final years, Clyde often spoke privately about his frustrations. He had given his entire adult life to cricket. He had achieved more than any black administrator before him. But he knew that if he were starting his career again as a young black player in the 2000s, he would still face many of the same challenges he had faced in the 1940s and 1950s. The racism had become more sophisticated, but it hadn't disappeared. This is what ultimately broke Clyde's heart. Not that his own career had been unsuccessful. It had been incredibly successful. But that his success hadn't translated into the kind of systematic change he had hoped to see. He had opened doors for himself, but many of those doors had quietly closed again after he walked through them. This chapter tries to assess the contribution that Walcott made to cricket as a player, administrator, and global icon, with particular reference to his role in challenging racial and social inequalities. The academic assessments of Clyde's life focus on his achievements, and rightly so. But they often miss the personal cost of being a pioneer. They miss the loneliness of being the first and often the only black person in rooms full of white administrators. They miss the exhaustion of having to prove yourself over and over again, even after you've already proven everything there is to prove. When Clyde died in 2006, cricket lost more than just a great player and administrator. It lost a man who had dedicated his entire life to making the game better, fairer, more inclusive. It lost someone who had sacrificed his own peace of mind in the hope that future generations wouldn't have to face the same battles he had faced. The tragedy is that Clyde's fears about the future of cricket have proven largely accurate. Even today, more than 15 years after his death, cricket administration is still dominated by people from traditional cricket countries. The same informal networks of power still exist. Young players from non-traditional backgrounds still face barriers that shouldn't exist. But Clyde's legacy isn't just about the problems that remain unsolved. It's also about the incredible example he set. He showed that it was possible for someone from a small Caribbean island to rise to the very top of world cricket. He proved that talent and determination could overcome even the most entrenched discrimination. He demonstrated that fighting for what's right is worth doing, even if you don't live to see the final victory. Clyde Walcott was a man who achieved everything and yet died heartbroken because he knew it wasn't enough. He was a pioneer who opened doors but never got to see those doors stay permanently open. He was a champion who won every battle except the one that mattered most to him, the battle for true equality in cricket. His story is a reminder that progress in fighting racism and discrimination is never guaranteed. That individual achievements, no matter how spectacular, don't automatically translate into systematic change, and that sometimes the people who achieve the most are also the ones who carry the heaviest burden of disappointment. Sir Clyde Walcott gave his life to cricket. He achieved more than almost anyone in the history of the game, but he died knowing that the cricket world he was leaving behind was still not the cricket world he had dreamed of creating. And maybe that's the real tragedy of his story. Not that he failed, but that he succeeded so completely, and yet the fundamental problems he fought against remained largely unchanged. Subscribe if this story opened your eyes about the real cost of fighting racism in sports, and share it to honor Sir Clyde's legacy.